The first of these is what I call spatial and typical correspondences. Okay, when you look at the sanctuary, we all know that there were three basic areas of work. But what did they represent? Now, in our earlier session this morning, session 3, I introduced you the idea of type and antitype, or according to the book of Hebrews, earthly and heavenly. I also introduced the idea that the concepts remain virtually intact, but the format is quite different. So to understand the spatial correspondences, we need to look at each area of the tabernacle. So the first is courtyard. Okay, so this is a courtyard. It's a fenced area. Everybody could enter into this fenced area, as you can see in the picture behind. But in the antitype or the heavenly, that courtyard is actually planet Earth. And you can see why, because of what happens there. What happens here is replicated by what happens here. Now, in this earthly sanctuary, this courtyard is considered holy space. Not as holy as the holy room, not as holy as the Holy of Holies. There were degrees of holiness. But the earth is considered in this antitype scenario as common space. It's not holy like that. There is no fence around the planet Earth as such, okay, to designate it as holy space. But we have also seen that something becomes holy virtually by the presence of God. So the moment there is contact with God in some ways, holiness ensues. Now in this courtyard, there was an altar. And this is where the sacrifices were done. And the animal sacrifices, as well as the grain sacrifices, those that were not eaten by the priests and their families, basically were burnt at the altar. Now, in the antitype, the fulfillment, there was no burning, there was no altar. Instead, what you have is a cross. The animal sacrifices that were burned at the altar here, Jesus is the sacrifice and he was crucified at the cross. Now, the idea is you need a sacrifice, but the sacrifice in here is not killed the same way as the sacrifice in there. Yes, there is still death involved. There is still blood involved, but a totally different format of death as well. Because in this area, sacrifice is consumed by fire. Every sacrifice that was not eaten by the priest, so either they were consumed by the priest or most of them were consumed by the fire. And remember that the burnt offering, the so-called ola, that was completely consumed by fire. That never became food, not even pieces of it. But in this fulfillment, Jesus is crucified. He is not consumed by fire. He is killed on a cross and then, he dies and he's buried and so on. The ola that is burned and the sin offerings that are burned, they basically are gone. Now, in this type scenario, there's daily sacrifice every morning, every evening, and according to individual needs, according to national needs, and so on and so forth. But in this antitype world, there's only one sacrifice. See, Hebrews tells us that that moment of death of Jesus offered a permanent, eternal sacrifice for all time, for all people. So Christ did not need to die again and again like the animal sacrifices. There was a priesthood based on the Levitical system out of the tribe of Levi. This was replaced largely with what the New Testament calls the priesthood of believers, with only Jesus as the high priest. The functions are the same, we will see later, but the format, as you can see readily here, is completely different, especially the way the sacrifices are handled. On an altar, animals consumed by fire. On a cross, Jesus crucified rather than consumed by fire. That's the first space. So that's the correspondence. Whatever happened in that courtyard happened on earth. Now, as we get deeper into the sanctuary, you have the holy place, or simply referred to as the holy. And this was a chamber, both in Solomon's temple and Moses' tabernacle. But there is no clear picture in the New Testament as to what corresponds to this place. It seems to me that the only possibility is perhaps to see heaven itself as the corresponding place, because it is holy enough that only some people were allowed in there, the Levites and the priests. Now you have a table of bread here, but here you have Jesus, who is the bread of life. You have a menorah or lampstand here, but here it is Jesus who's the light of the world. You have an incense altar here, but you have the intercession of Jesus in this aspect. Notice you still need bread, you still need light, you still need intercession, but the format is totally different. Now here we are told that priests had to enter the holy place every single day, in fact twice a day, to perform their duties. The New Testament makes a big deal about the fact that Jesus enters once. There are some people who thought that there's some kind of double entry that takes place, but neither the book of Hebrews nor Revelation, the two that actually address the subject, present that fact. In fact, Hebrews very clearly says that he entered into the presence of God once. And in Revelation 5, he entered into the throne room and sat with God on his throne once. So there is an entry, but the format is different. A daily entry is replaced by a once in eternity entry. There is the need for sustenance, but it is a spiritual one now versus a physical one. There's a need for light, but it is a spiritual light versus a physical light. There's a need for intercession, but it is a person who intercedes versus something that happens at a physical altar. So the disconnect between format and concept gets even bigger when we enter the holy place. Now it is in the Holy of Holies that we see the largest disconnect between format and type, or antitype and type. What happened in that tabernacle of Moses and the temple of Solomon is very different from what it represents in this new reality. In the tabernacle or the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies was a chamber, it was a room. In the new reality or the kingdom of God, this is replaced by a holy city. And the only real connection between them are the throne of God and the geometrical figure of a perfect cube. So both the holy city and the chamber were perfect cubes, and that connects those together. The Holy of Holies contained a throne box. We call it the Ark of the Covenant, but really it was intended to convey the picture of God and his throne. That's why the rabbis believed that there was this Shekinah light that hung over that to represent the physical presence of God. But when we look at the throne room visions of the Bible, these are mainly in Exodus, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation. Basically only 5 of them. There's a reference to God's throne room in Zechariah, but no physical description. When you collate all the material of these 5 descriptions of God's throne room, what you find is a throne palanquin on wheels. And it was mobile, it was portable, it did not stay in one place, it moved around the cosmos or whatever we know of as heaven. Okay. Whereas the throne box stayed put in one space. It never moved anywhere. It only moved when they were traveling, when the whole structure was traveling. Ezekiel has not been studied enough by those who love Revelation, but a lot of the imageries of Revelation, particularly about the throne of God, come from Ezekiel. And it is important to note the importance of this throne palanquin. Now, if you're not sure what a palanquin is, in the ancient world, you see this in Chinese movies, you see it in some of the films from Europe about royalty. Before wheels were really invented, the royal personage is carried on a throne. Basically a seat that is kind of encased and looks kind of like a throne. And you see it in almost every Chinese kung fu movies that concerns, the yin and yang and Shaolin and all those things. In fact, I just watched one this week where, the soldiers are carrying this throne and the royal person is sitting on the inside. We have a description of such a palanquin in the Song of Songs. When Solomon came to meet this bride-to-be, he was carried on a palanquin and accompanied by a 60-strong security guard. And you find the angels around the throne room of God are representing a similar concept. In the physical tabernacle of Moses, there were golden angels. There were cherubs over that throne, but they were made of gold. In the throne room of God, the actual throne room of God, we have living angels. Isaiah describes them as 6 wings, or rather 3 pairs. Elsewhere, it seems they have 2 wings. Isaiah says that they were beings that were on fire. I think that was a description of how glorious and how bright that they were, and so on and so forth. So there are angels, but these angels are real. They move about, they move with the throne. These are fixed to that kaporet. You have a high priest who ministers just for a short time during his lifetime. Here you have a high priest who ministers forever. That's why Hebrews makes a big deal about Jesus replacing the Aaronic priesthood because of the mortality of priests. Now, Yom Kippur, the cleansing, the renewal of the sanctuary, including the Holy of Holies, that took place annually. Now, the Jews still celebrate Yom Kippur, and today is Yom Kippur, even though there's no tabernacle anymore. It has become a spiritual experience in the lives of modern-day Jews in the absence of a physical structure. So even the Jewish religion moved from its understanding of Yom Kippur as a very physical festival to one that is more spiritual in nature, emphasizing more the need to be right with God, to be connected, not to be cut off, being judged, and so on and so forth. Now, in the antitype here, we have a cleansing that is permanent. This is why Paul is able to say with such conviction, there is no condemnation for anyone who is in Christ Jesus, and nothing can separate us from the love of God. In this cleansing on the type side, in the tabernacle, it had to happen every year because Israel would go through that cycle of sin. Yes, they would be perfectly sinless in Yom Kippur, but then it starts again the following morning, and for the next 359 days, they would go through the cycle, and then they would come back to Yom Kippur. But in this cleansing, sin is not cycled again and again. It is dealt with once and for all. And then, of course, you have the situation with the second goat. In the physical Yom Kippur, there was an actual goat called Azazel, or representing Azazel. And this goat would be taken out of the sanctuary, symbolizing the movement of sin outside of the sanctuary, taken out of the camp of Israel, showing the further movement away from Israel, and then eventually killed or exterminated. We're not sure exactly how they got rid of that goat. One theory is that they would find a high place, push the goat over, and it would die. Most likely they killed the animal and then buried it in the sand. When they got into the land, there were lots of places where this goat could be taken out of the picture. And there is a picture in the New Testament that highlights how Satan is eventually removed from the picture. See, one of the big questions of faith is, what is God doing about the presence of Satan? Is he doing anything at all, or is Satan going to be a permanent coexisting evil? In fact, that's one of the theological theories that has appeared in Christian history, that sin will always coexist with the new world. But Revelation 20 tells us that Satan will be destroyed. Whereas on this side, it is the animal sacrifice that is destroyed by fire. On this side, it is Azazel who is destroyed by fire. You see, what the sanctuary does is it actually shows us how sin will finally come to an end. Now, the Israelites needed that lesson every year. Because the one thing I've learned as being a teacher for over 40 years is this, that students have very short-term memories. There are very few students who have real long-term memories. And studies of student learning patterns tell us that most students will remember, say, a week from today or a month from today, about 20%. So there's a good chance that you're sitting here and you're listening to me, you're watching these slides, and unless you review them, you go over them again and again, you'll probably forget most of what is here. The latest studies show that high school and university student learning patterns today has a time limit of about 7 minutes. You know, any church that has lots of young people should never have a sermon that is more than 10 minutes, because there's no way they're going to remember. In a world that is dominated by this gadget, which basically removes human remembering from the equation, students don't remember. So Israel had to relive this experience every year. That is the significance of Yom Kippur. Now, Christians have learned that the atonement that Christ made, many Christians believe, was completed totally on the cross. But the New Testament shows that it actually does not complete, that whole act of redemption does not complete until Satan is removed from the equation. Because until then, sin still hangs around. And we will have a look briefly at how complicated, how complex sin is, then you'll understand why this is necessary. So when you bring a sacrifice to the tabernacle, sin sacrifice or olah, burn it there at the altar, you are considered perfect in the eyes of God. But the sin itself that represents what you have done is transferred into the presence of God via the movement of blood or movement of priests. And it's only on Yom Kippur that it is finally removed. Only when that high priest has sprinkled the blood of Yahweh's goat on all the articles and on Israel, and then places his hand on the goat Azazel, and that goat is taken out of the camp and destroyed, only then did Israel know for sure that sin is gone. So one of the biggest questions of faith that has been raised by God's people for thousands of years is answered here in the sanctuary, and it's corroborated in Revelation. Satan will be taken out of the picture ultimately, and at that point there will be no more sin in the universe. Now, you and I know that sin did not actually begin on this earth. It began in the presence of God. And so the cleansing of the universe becomes important. And that's what Yom Kippur is meant to teach us. That's why Yom Kippur services began in the Holy of Holies and ends with Azazel being removed from the picture. So those are the spatial correspondences that exist. Again, concept is the same, format is totally different. You know, a room becomes a city, a box becomes a palanquin, gold angels are actual living angels, you know, a mortal high priest, immortal high priest, repeated exercise, permanent exercise. But the one that I like most about this correspondence is the assurance that Satan will be removed from the universe. He will meet his endpoint. He will not be allowed to coexist the way Chinese cosmology believes in the coexistence of yin and yang, dark and light. It must always coexist. This is not in the Bible. And it's only the tabernacle. So when Moses was shown what this will all mean, that's what he was shown, not just a physical structure to build, but a spiritual structure to teach the Israelites. This is why the Torah is so important to understanding anything in the New Testament. because embedded in the Torah and in the rituals of the sanctuary are these lessons of how God is dealing with sin. So what is God doing about sin? Well, he is dealing with it on an individual basis, and then time will come when it will be permanently removed from the equation. But more important than this is what I call functional correspondence. Okay, so what really happened if you were to boil down these three spaces into single word, what would that be? Well, in the courtyard, the main function is sacrifice, day in, day out, every morning, every evening, and sometimes the whole day maybe. And so in this antitype or heavenly one, there is sacrifice as well. In the holy place, the tamid means application or mediation, the lighting of the lamp, the occasional changing of the bread, the offering of incense, representing the prayers of Israel. It was constantly applying the sacrifice, the blood of the sacrifice on behalf of the worshippers. And we are told in the New Testament, in more than one book, that we have a priestly advocate in the presence of God. I like the way that John puts it in 1 John. Little children, I wish that you do not sin. But if you do sin, we have an advocate with the Father. And so there is a high priest who mediates in the presence of God. This is why the high priest had those 12 special stones representing every tribe of Israel. This is why he had those special stones called Urim and Thummim, through which God can communicate his will. He also embodies connection to nature with all those almond figures hanging at the base of his second robe. It was an amazing piece of thing. Angels and nature figures were embroidered into his effort, that half robe that covers his other robes. And then in the Holy of Holies, of course, is the cleansing or renewal judgment, which results in the final eradication of sin. And so when you look at Revelation, you see a sequence of judgments leading up to chapters 19 and 20. First, the threat of judgments in the seven churches, and then the beginning of judgments in the seals, and then the crescendo of judgments in the trumpets, and a climax in the plagues. But then when you get into 19 and 20, you find Christ executing judgment. In those earlier, angels were given the task. And so Christ is depicted as this heavenly warrior with a giant sword and riding the winepress of God, trampling the wicked under his feet, and the blood of all this trampling splatters on and kicks his entire beautiful white robe. It's a very frightening picture of that final judgment of Christ anywhere in Scripture. And then that leads up to Revelation 20, so the great harvest, and then the lake of fire. And in the lake of fire, Satan is removed from the picture. Revelation 20 is very specific about who are taken out at the lake of fire. Anyone who followed Satan and refused to follow Christ, they become the object. They become part of Azazel system, if you like. And we are told them that Satan and all his proxy agents, the different beasts that you meet in Revelation, and all those who follow him through these beasts or directly, all of those will be burned up at the lake of fire. And then only John saw a new heaven and a new earth. See, the first time that God attempted to eradicate sin on earth was with the flood of Noah. What is important about the flood of Noah is not only did it clean the sin of that original world, but it also reshaped the planet. What we have now is not what Noah and the previous generation saw. I'm sure that Noah and his sons and their wives, when they walked out of that ark, they would have gone like, where is our world? Because what they saw, completely different. It was transformed earth. Now, despite thousands of years of sin, this planet is still very beautiful in many ways. And all of us take holidays to these beautiful beaches, mountaintop areas, ski resorts, because we are enamored by the beauty of nature. But we are also very much well aware, particularly with climate change issues in our world, of the damage that nature brings. We've all seen what happened recently in Libya, in Morocco, the giant storms in North America, the 140-year unique storms and floodings in Hong Kong. Amazing things are happening to the earth. And even those who do not believe in God are wondering when all this is going to end. When is this drama going to end? Only at this final judgment. In other words, Yom Kippur really doesn't take place until the culmination of those judgments in Revelation, which means the harvest, the lake of fire, and the recreation. So that's what happens. Now, if we are to look at this pictorially, we did this with our second session. Now we need to complete it. The first space here we call the outer court, or known to some people via the King James translation as the courtyard. This was followed by an inner chamber simply called the holy, obviously implying a holy place because it was space, and then followed by the Holy of Holies. Now, all of this was considered holy, as well as the entire camp of Israel. That's why in Yom Kippur, that goat Azazel had to be taken out of the camp because it carried all the sins symbolically. It could not remain anywhere in the camp because it's only when you step outside the camp that the holiness equation kind of stops. But we also learned that there are degrees of holiness. Very high degree, a slightly lower degree, much lower degree, and then around the 10th, a lower degree of holiness. Now, the thing to remember about all this, as long as you're within the camp of Israel, you are considered holy by God. You don't have to be in here, and you definitely cannot be in here, but you're still considered holy by God. But in each of these spaces, a specific activity took place. In this outer court, the main activity is the sacrifice activity. This is the activity that dealt on a daily basis or individual basis with sin. And so when you commit a sin, you bring a katat, or you bring an awon, or you bring an olah. This was an acknowledgement that you have sinned, and then all the rituals say, okay, you are forgiven, and your sin has been atoned for. Remember the three terms that are applied constantly in Leviticus with sacrifices: a pleasing aroma to God, forgiveness is given, atonement is made. Now, a person who has brought a sacrifice is considered perfect in the eyes of God because the sin is transferred from that person onto the sacrifice. This is why the blood of the sacrifice was mostly splashed around this altar. I think there was a physical reason for it, to make sure that blood doesn't remain and stink up the place because it would be consumed by the heat of that altar. But also the symbolism is that the animal that dies here has died on behalf of that worshipper, and therefore the worshipper is absolved. He is acquitted of his sin. The second space we have is holy place. This is where the priest has to go in. Many times he has to change things in there, but most importantly, he has to offer the incense, the prayers, and the smoke of those incense had only two directions to go. It could float outwards back through this curtain to outside, but most of the time it seemed that the smoke simply floated up through here into this place. We know from the architectural design that the curtains in this second curtain between Holy and Holy of Holies had a space at the top. This would allow the smoke to go in there. And so the intercession of the priests standing so close to the presence of God and praying on behalf of Israel, offering their prayers, mediation, or if you like a bigger theological word, intercession. What happened in the Holy of Holies. We have traditionally used the word cleansing, and it's fine because sin is actually cleansed. It's cleaned out in a way. As one of the questions was, how did they actually do that cleaning? And we really don't know how they did that. We know they could not take down the curtain. We know no one else could touch that curtain except by permission of God when they travel. And so there must have been some mechanism whereby the presence of God would clean the sanctuary itself. In today's scholarship, the suggestion is that the word renewal better reflects what really happens in the Holy of Holies with Yom Kippur. So the nation, the place of God, the things of God, the people of God all get a new lease on life. Everything is renewed. And so you have sacrifice here, you have mediation here, you have renewal here. In Protestant theology, this sacrifice element is described as something substitutionary or vicarious. And this is important because while the New Testament does not use the word vicarious, it does use the word substitution to explain that Jesus' death is a substitution for our sins. Isaiah talks about it too, that the sufferings of the lamb, of the servant, is on behalf of the people. And so in the outer court, there is sacrifice. In the holy place, there is mediation or intercession. In the Holy of Holies, there is that cleansing process, which leads to renewal. Now, why does all of this have to happen? Couldn't God have given them a structure that has just one room and everything embedded in that room? Well, they had to learn the complexity of sin. When we look through the Bible, we discover that sin involves a penalty. For the wages of sin is death, says Paul. Sin is the transgression of the law, says John. We also learn that sin is a power. In Paul's monologue, that which I want to do, I cannot do, and that which I don't want to do, I do. If I do what I don't want to do and don't do what I want to do, it's because sin resides in me. It's like there are two powers within me. Oh, wretched man that I am, he says. And this is Paul writing Romans about halfway through his missionary work. So this is not a new convert Paul. This is an old Christian Paul who's still struggling with sin. And then sin as a presence. We discover something that is often ignored about the writings of Paul. But we see this in the Old Testament quite clearly, that the earth, the planet, the environment suffered because of sin. Modern science is telling us that human activity is the primary cause for climate change. Let me share you one simple little fact about climate change, which is ignored by every human being on earth. Whenever we throw away food, it goes to a garbage landfill or whatever. Most countries don't have a proper means of disposing food wastage. And that food, as it begins to rot, creates methane. Methane, carbon dioxide, these are the two main gases that envelop the earth, bringing us the phenomenon we call global warming, preventing the heat from the earth escaping into the outer atmosphere and cloaking that heat inside, causing climate change. Now you may wonder, what's that got to do with me? Well, here's some couple of statistics, one from the UN, one from the Thailand government recently. According to UN statistics, 60% of the food wastage of the world comes from households, not factories or restaurants, but household, your house, my house. 60% of this food wastage, which then converts into methane and adds to global warming, comes from our houses. The Thailand government recently released some statistic about food wastage in Thailand. You may want to search what happens in Malaysia. And I think even the government researchers were a little bit surprised that every person in Thailand throws away about 143 kilograms of food every year. Now, Thailand has a population of nearly 70 million people. How many metric tons, how many million metric tons of food wastage that converts itself into methane? So sin is a physical presence. You and I will always be in this planet, the sinful planet. That's why it has to be recreated. That's why it requires Yom Kippur judgment. So Azazel will be removed from the picture, and then everything is new. But sin also exists at different levels. You know, when I was a kid growing up in the church, I often heard people say this: sin is sin. Well, this is not biblical. It sounds fine. It's a nice cliche: sin is sin. But sin is not sin. There are different types and different levels of sin. Okay, the simplest kind of sin, which mostly means that you are breaking some law of God, is called katat, which is the same word as the sin offering, by the way. Now, at this level, sin simply means that you don't reach the ideal, you miss the mark. The word katat comes from the world of archery, you know, where you're shooting at the bull's eye, but you don't quite hit the bull's eye. Those of you who have played darts or whatever, you know, or if you are in Sarawak, you know, the blowpipe. Curious story. Many years ago, the theology students, this was years before I met Pastor Ho and Mei Hui, we went on a reunion in Sarawak. So we went to this Iban village museum kind of thing. And there they had the Iban blowpipe thing. You could pay some ringgit, I think it was 1 ringgit or something in those days. And then you can try and blow the blowpipe. My department head at the time from Finland, he couldn't even get that dart to hit the target. Never mind the bullseye. Couldn't hit the target at all. And so he made a joke about this is why Europeans invented guns, because they don't know how to blow. Anyway, the Sabah and Sarawak students challenged me to try the blowpipe. And we all did. I was, I don't know, lucky or whatever. I managed to get very close to that bullseye. But most of us miss. That's the nature of archery. If you can actually get that bullseye, then you'll be world champion in the Olympics or whatever. So there is sin that is like that. We are born with some genetic faults, with some character flaws, and we do the wrong things even when we don't try to do it. And so it happens to the best of us. But this sin is the easiest for God to deal because it is relatively straightforward. Second one is more complex. It's completely relation-based. It's called Wann. It's a very expensive sacrifice. It involves repaying the thing you did for cheating somebody, and put all of that together, you have a very serious offense. So this is going deeper into sin. And then you have a third level called pesha. This is the sin that could only be handled during Yom Kippur. It could not be handled by Tamid because you could not bring a sacrifice for it. It depended only on that renewal process of Yom Kippur. Now, these first two, Katat and Awan, these were dealt with in the Tamid daily regular experience. This was dealt with Pesha. There is forgiveness, there is atonement, but there is no sacrifice available. It all depends on whether God wants to grant the forgiveness or not. But there is a fourth level, which is non-redeemable, no grace, no sacrifice, no atonement, no forgiveness. It's called Yadrom. Now, Yadrom is the Hebrew equivalent of sticking your middle finger in today's world. You know what that means in our world today, right? If you stick your middle finger at somebody, this is like sticking your middle finger at God, whole hand. Jesus speaks about this. He uses the language of Numbers where this is first recorded. He says that every sin can be forgiven. He's talking about these three levels, except the sin against the Holy Spirit. Yad Rom basically is saying I don't care about you. I don't want to have anything to do with you. King of Judah that embodied Yadrom was a man called Ahaz. This is how Yadrom works. He was under pressure, enemies all around. They were preparing a big launch against him. And it looked like Judah had no chance of survival. God sent Isaiah to Ahaz and said, don't worry, I'm here. God says, I will make sure that you are not defeated by these enemies. And you know what Ahaz said? Who asked for your help? God says, anyway, I will give you a sign so that you will know I'll be there to help you. Ahaz says, who asked you for sign? God says, I will give you a sign anyway. Bible quiz time. You can answer it in your free time. What was the sign that God gave Ahaz? It became a messianic sign. And it is the basis that allowed Paul to say that God loved us while we were still enemies. God did not love us in response to our love. Okay? So Yadrom is like Ahaz saying, I don't need you. I don't need your help. I don't want your signs. I don't want to have anything to do with you. That's why there's no redemption possible, because it's tying God's hand. He cannot do anything for such an individual. And so sin is not sin. This sin is very different. This sin is so serious that you have to wait for Yom Kippur, you know. But these sins are handled on a more normal basis, but even they are differentiated by weight. You know, this is very light, gets really heavy, it's extremely heavy. This is crashing. Okay. So sin is very complex. And because of that, the sanctuary tells us how God deals with each level of sin bit by bit by bit until everything can be tackled with. Which then tells us that salvation itself is complex. First, it requires a legal solution. That's where the sacrifice comes. So the sacrifice can deal with numbers 1 and 2, or levels 1 and 2. It requires mediation by another. That's where priestly advocate comes, because somebody has to apply that on your behalf. It doesn't just work automatically. That's what Jesus does on our behalf. And then it requires judgment, which can lead to eradication. And that's what the high priest did on Yom Kippur. You know, today being Yom Kippur, is a really good day that we are doing this final part of the sanctuary message. And so legal solution, which some scholars call it the forensics of salvation. You bring a sacrifice, and the sacrifice is according to the instructions of God, and your sin is forgiven. The high priest does the mediation on your behalf. So even if you do sin, we have an advocate with the Father. That's what the New Testament says. The high priest, he enters the Holy of Holies, begins this renewal process, cleans everything up. Azazel is driven into the desert. All this is judgment taking place, and we have new heaven and new earth. You know, Revelation is a reenactment basically of Yom Kippur from beginning to end. It starts with God dealing with his church, and then with the world, and then with Satan himself. And then we have a new heavens and new earth. I don't know about you, but I love those early verses in Revelation 21. I saw new heavens and a new earth. Everything had passed away. There was no more sea. There are no more tears. There's no more pain. There's no more suffering. There's no more death. All the things that are symptomatic of sin are eradicated. When people get very sick, the first thing a good doctor does is to inquire about symptoms. Are you feeling any pain? Where are you feeling pain? Now, I'm generally a very healthy person, but my body, for whatever reason, is prone to kidney stones. And I pass, I think, quite a lot of kidney stones, because every few years I will have a kidney stone attack. In 2012, I was in Jerusalem on Sabbath, this huge Bible conference of all theological professors from around the world, and woke up early Sabbath morning, waiting to go to church. This is in the middle of East Jerusalem. and there was an attack, and it was heavy, it was bad. And I thought, kidney stone pain is really awful. You're tempted to think, oh, you're going to die. It doesn't actually kill you, especially these days. They're much better at dealing with it. And so a friend of mine had to help me to the front desk. Can you recommend a hospital? Now, this was Shabbat in Jerusalem. Careful about getting sick on Shabbat in Jerusalem. And the concierge said, sorry, hospitals are not open normally. It's Shabbat. Huh? What do they do? Well, they basically only look after extreme emergency cases and inpatient care. So what can I do? Don't worry, this is Israel. We have doctors on standby. Oh, really? Okay, so the concierge called somebody up, and about 30 minutes later, this lady doctor arrived at my room. Israeli doctors are really good at diagnosing because it's the only country where they still make house calls. They have to because of Shabbat. She had a little lab kit with her and everything. So she asked me, what's wrong? She could see I'm sweating profusely. I'm running a fever and I'm racked in pain. I could not stand up straight or sit up straight. Where's the pain? She felt around my body. And then she did, on the spot, a quick urine and blood test and said, yes, you have kidney stones. I will give you something to help you pass the stones. She was sure they were not big stones. And being an Asian Sabbath keeper in Jerusalem, I made a mistake. So when she had finished, how much will it be and how do I pay you? And she said, sorry, I cannot take any payment. It is Shabbat. I'm like, really? So how do I pay you? She said, I will come back after sundown and check on you again. Then you can pay me at that time. You see, can you imagine what they would do during Yom Kippur? Today, Yom Kippur is celebrated over 3 days. And all 3 days are considered Shabbats, by the way. It's complex. This is what God does for us. And so sin is such a complex issue that God cannot just simply snap a finger and sin is gone, it's disappeared. It involves the environment, it involves human emotion, human will, human cognition. It involves relationships between humans, between God himself and humans. And so the process is complex because sin itself is complex. And all of this is embedded in the sanctuary. So the sanctuary tells us that God is definitely going to remove sin, but he is working on a process that we might consider slow, but in God's time, is it really slow? And so it is going to be resolved. And when we understand the sanctuary message about sin and salvation, maybe we can rest more peacefully at night. Maybe we can be guilt-free in our Christian experience, because it doesn't matter what our sin is unless you do yadrom, Christ will find a way to deal with it. And so you can sleep at peace, even if we know we have done something wrong. There was such a strong emphasis on sin and judgment when I was growing up, and being a rather religious kid, I had nightmares. I had fitful sleeps because I was afraid of the judgment of God. Because we were told that if you had one sin unconfessed and your name comes up in the judgment, as if God actually needs to do that tonight, then you will go to hell because of that one sin. I heard preachers saying, if you don't do this or you don't achieve this, you will go to hell. Really? This is not how God works. That's why God takes his time to solve not just humanity's problem, but every human being's problem. Mine, yours, and everyone else. So let's piece it all together in one giant chart. I hope you can read. Cannot make the fonts any larger and squeeze them into one slide. But as you will be getting this material, maybe you'll have a chance to slow down through it. Look at the 3 P's of sin: penalty, power, and presence. And in regards to salvation, the penalty requires acquittal, not simply anything else, but acquittal. The old Christian word for it was justification, but a Christian lawyer told me that in today's legal terms, you should not use justification because it has a very different legal meaning. This was the legal aspect of sin. And he said the most appropriate term is, and most OT scholars kind of agree these days, it's acquittal. The power is dealt with through mediation. So every time you and I, even though we are acquitted, but we still have the tendency and we will fail, we have an advocate. If you sin, John says, we have an advocate with the Father. And the presence is removed through the process of renewal. In the sanctuary, that happens in a courtyard, substitute sacrifice, the work of the priest through the intercession of Tamid, and then the work of the high priest through Yom Kippur, the Holy of Holies. And notice that all this is applied to who Jesus is and what he does. He is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, so we are acquitted because of him. He is the priest who mediates. We have one standing before the Father on our behalf. And then we have the high priest who will actually renew the planet and remove sin from the cosmos. And so the sanctuary, when God told Moses to build a sanctuary, he also had Moses spend a lot of time on the mountain. I think it was God's way of teaching these lessons to Moses. So Moses, this is what you're going to see through the sanctuary. All the things that God has to do on your behalf because of all the things that has happened because of sin. Now, it was intriguing that God picked Israel because if there ever was a nation that specialized in sin and yet experienced the full display of God's salvation through the sanctuary, it was Israel. They received the 10 Commandments, signed off the covenant. We will do everything God says. A few days later, they were worshiping a golden calf. The cycles of sin in the life of Israel leading up to the exile is just incredible. Some people in Israel committed Yadron, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, Ahaz, and some other kings, Ahab. And so God is dealing with all those, but most of them stayed in the 3 levels of sin, and so God is dealing with them. And so what the sanctuary did for ancient Israel is to show them this is what it takes. If you sin against God, you're going to have to bring an animal. You're going to have to bring a sacrifice. And when that sacrifice is killed, remember that you are alive because the sacrifice is killed. So you are acquitted. But just in case you keep sinning, so the priest keeps burning the olah, the priest keeps burning the incense. And then on Yom Kippur, sin is gone. Okay, implications. The sanctuary, with its focus on kadosh, on holiness, tells us that all this is an equation about holiness, because holy describes God, and God says, be holy like me. Well, this is how it works. First, at a horizontal view of it, and then a vertical view of it. It moves from something that is considered normal to something that's considered completely abnormal. So, for example, normal life, then life may become increasingly abnormal because of sin, and then total disorder, which is called death. In terms of space, the highest space is Holy of Holies, and then the holy, less holy, and the courtyard less holy, the camp less holy, outside the camp no more holy, but then you have Sheol, which is the total opposite of the holy. This is where death exists, the ultimate symbol of sin. In terms of people, God is holy, holy, holy. The priests are holy. The Levites are holier than the Israelites, but the Israelites are the holy people of God. And then you can have unclean persons like lepers, disease, handicapped, and so on, disabled. And then you have dead persons. That's why very holy people like the priests could never come in contact with dead person. And this is why, according to the laws of Torah, you cannot kill an animal outside the camp, because that would make the animal on this level, and you are Israelite, therefore it has to be killed in a clean place, which is here. So if you wanted to eat goat, you cannot kill it outside the camp. You have to bring it to the courtyard as part of a sacrifice, and then only that goat becomes fit for food. And then perfection. Perfection can be blemished, and it can be seen as clean or unclean, and we will see how that is portrayed better at the vertical level. And then carcass. Carcass is totally out of the picture. It's as if there is an invisible line that separates life. As long as we are on the left side of this line, we are still a part of God's world. If anything and anyone falls to the right side of this line, then that is doomed to something else. You see, when the Bible speaks about salvation, it also tells us that there is a line past which salvation does not work, whether you think of the sin of Yadrom or some other thing. Our last slide for this study is holiness in its vertical movement. At the top end of the scale is the holy, and that's really God. And if humans want to be in his world, they will become holy too. At the bottom end of this scale is cherem. Cherem means devoted to destruction. So anything that becomes cherem, like a person who commits yadrom, that's it, they will be destroyed. Interestingly, anything that you devote to God is also considered cherem, which means only God can decide what to do with it. That's what happened to Ananias and Sapphira. They promised an offering to God, it became cherem, and when they tried to take some of it back, boom, they were struck by the radiation of holiness. Here's the thing, holy will always destroy cherem. So anything that is here in cherem, horizontally beyond that line, will be destroyed by the holy. God will not destroy anyone, any city, any nation until it reaches cherem level. That's why God waited an extra 120 years before sending the flood and Noah's world to make sure that the world had reached cherem. That's why Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, because they had reached cherem. But God still came down to Abraham and said, I have come to inspect for myself to see whether the evil spoken about these cities is really as great as they are. And even then the angels waited hours inside Sodom and Gomorrah to try and convince Lot and his family to get out. So when you read judgments of God that lead to death in the Bible, the Old Testament particularly, that is cherem at work. When you read the plagues, the 7 plagues in Revelation, the lake of fire, the winepress of God, of Christ, that is cherem at work. But in between, you have what is called the common. That's where you and I are. And the common is seen as making up of 2 aspects. It can be clean or it can be unclean. So food can be clean or unclean. Clothes can be clean or unclean. Persons can be clean or unclean. A house can be clean or unclean. Unclean usually is a category decided by God, not something we decide by us. It's not about hygiene or chemistry. And the common can move to become clean. All right, that's why you can only eat clean animals. Or it can move to become unclean. And so if you eat an animal that God has declared unclean, then the person also becomes unclean. But the common can also become holy. And so God's people, Israel, can become holy, can become the people of Yahweh. But here's the sad part. Holy can be degraded to common. This is why the prophets like Isaiah was so upset with Judah for degrading the sacrifice system from the level of holy to the level of common. This is what angered Jesus when he entered the temple and they had turned the courtyards into a marketplace. You recall what he said as he cleaned the courtyard? Why have you turned my house from being a house of prayer to being a common marketplace? So it can be degraded. And the common can also become harem. Well, most of the time when it involves people, it usually goes this way, through unclean to harem. And the most tragic of all is this: the holy can become harem too. So two sons of Aaron, priests, holy persons, went into the sanctuary, the tabernacle, to offer unauthorized fire, and they were immediately killed by God on the spot. There are theories that the people of Israel became so worried about the life of their priests that they would tie ropes to their ankles. There is no historical proof they actually did that, just in case something happened to them, so that they can drag them out. What we do see in the Gospels is a grave concern on the part of the worshippers when Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, was delayed inside the temple. They thought something bad had happened to him. What you don't see in this equation is harem can never go this way. So anything that becomes harem is then destroyed. That's why Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, Noah's world became harem, so will it be in the days when the Son of Man returns. Jesus will not come back until the planet has actually reached harem. When you look at the harem condition of Noah's world, it was not just spiritual or moral, it was also environmental. And I think that we are getting very close to that point ourselves. But the fact that we are still here and Jesus hasn't yet returned means that the world still has a chance. We are on a holding pattern. We haven't quite reached harem. When I was pastoring Jurong Church in Singapore, Jurong English Church in Singapore, I had this young man. He was about 19 at the time. And every Sabbath, he was a very sensitive young man. He would come to church and say, "Oh, Pastor Fanwar, I think I have committed the unpardonable sin." Yes, unpardonable sin gets you down here for sure. And so we would talk about why he thought that was the case. But this thing went on week after week, and he was very faithful to church. He was a decent human being, a decent Christian. And so one day I told him, I said, "I don't think so." He got a little bit shocked. "I'm sure I've committed the unpardonable sin." And he said, "Why are you saying I have not?" I said, "If you have committed the unpardonable sin, you won't be standing here talking to me. You won't have a sense that you have done it." And it kind of changed his life. He never realized that unpardonable sin means you become harem and you could be struck dead on your feet. Okay. And so he also realized that a person who commits harem is like Ahaz, does not sense the need for God and does not want God in their lives. And so whether you look at it horizontally, a line that separates the harem side, or vertically, you and I are from here, but hopefully we are on the red arrow. I don't know what's happening in your life or my life, but I have faith that because of Christ working on my behalf, and because I have chosen Jesus as my Lord and Savior, that I am somewhere on this. Remember what Paul says, "I do not consider that I have accomplished this, but we are like in a race. We keep moving forward." So we move in this direction. And this is why it's important for me as an individual Christian to know everything that God wants of me. Not just the 10 words that we know as 10 commandments, but everything that God expects of me. That loving our enemy, and so on and so forth. On Friday nights, I'm doing a series for a group here in Bangkok at the moment on Corinthian letters of Paul. And last night we dealt with the problems in the church of Corinth. And one of the things Paul said about their problem is that they had cases they were taking to court, they were suing each other in court. And Paul says, you are God's people. How can the people of the world settle your cases? And then Paul makes this incredible statement there, the difference between being common and heading in this direction or being common and heading in this direction. He says, instead of taking each other to court, suing one another in a civil court, you are better off accepting the injustice that comes to you than doing that. Paul says that accepting that injustice and living with it is victory in faith. Taking your fellow church member to court over whatever, that is defeat for faith. So to apply Paul's language in Corinth, you're angry with somebody, you have a dispute about, say, land, inheritance, or whatever, and you sue them in court, that is taking you here. You accept the injustice that you might lose that land, that property, or whatever, that is taking you up here. It's a different world. It's a different world. And that is what the tabernacle shows us. That's the message. We are to be a holy people. So Jesus says, if you love only those who love you, you are no better than the criminals who can do that. This is the path. But if you love your enemies, those who want to take your life, this is the path. If you take the broad road where everybody travels on, that super motorway, this is the path. But if you drive that mountain country road, single lane road that you have to struggle staying awake, this is the path. What path is your life on today? Are you headed towards Cherem or towards holy? There are only two options. And all over the Bible, you meet these same two options. In Deuteronomy, curses and blessings. In the Psalms, wise and fool. In Jesus' teaching, narrow road and broad road. And so Israel had to make a choice. And when they made a wrong choice, they often ended up here so many times. But as long as you don't descend down here, everything is kind of okay. But once, like Ahaz, if you get down here, then there's no way back. And when the whole planet reaches down here, Jesus will return. Jesus is not coming back because we haven't had enough problems in this world. Okay, the world has not yet reached the level of Cherem. That's what the sanctuary teaches. If it does, that's it. It's the end. Because the holy will destroy Cherem. So the world cannot keep existing. So the sanctuary even tells me why we are not yet in heaven, so to speak. Why we are still in this sin-laden world, because God is waiting and giving opportunity and giving chance to everybody to try and move up here. As promised by Peter, God is not willing that any should perish. God does not want anybody on this road. I love the way that the late Maurice Venden used to present this, that God would erect barriers so that it makes it difficult for you to simply slide down to hell. Think of Cherem as hell, whatever you understand hell to be. And so, what path are you on? What path have you learned from here?